Week 11 is in the books. Honestly, a really weird week with a lot of down games. It felt like across the board from a lot of key fantasy options. So hopefully, Nate, we can regroup and bounce back for week 12 because we got some new waiver wire targets to go over. So I'm John Macri, and for this episode of the PFF Fantasy Podcast, I'll be Nate and I will be going over all the top waiver options heading into week 12. So Nate, like I said, I don't know about you, felt like a weird fantasy week. A lot of the top, there were some big scores, right? But we had a lot of down performances from top names. Obviously, a whole new list of injuries to go over as well. So, how are you doing heading into week 12?
I'm doing fine for the most part. We have a lot of injuries at wide receiver, so especially doing rankings for this upcoming week at wide receiver is weird. So a lot of fantasy managers will be looking for wide receiver. The one nice thing is those of you who drafted a tight end early have been rewarded recently. Trey McBride's been consistently excellent for the past month plus now. Brock Bowers, perfectly fine game, 7 catches, 72 yards. George Kittle scored the 2 touchdowns. So at least if you drafted a tight end early, hopefully you had a good week this week.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah. For those of us who went tight end early, yeah, Trey McBride, obviously big. I mean, Josh Allen drafters have been happy. Not so much the rest of the quarterbacks, right? And the other positions. I mean, it's been hit and miss because injuries have been so bad, but also guys underperforming too. Like we were talking about it just before we came on. Ashton Genty just 6 carries for 7 yards last night. Like that is not at all what we drafted him to be this year. I understand, the Raiders offense wasn't good, but we also expect him to get the ball a lot more than that and obviously be more effective too. So a lot of adjusting we've had to do this offseason, and that's going to continue all the way through the fantasy championship round. And that's what we're here to do this week. We're going to go over our top waiver targets, obviously heading into week 12. We're going to try to persevere through the injuries and find some adjustments as we go to fill in those holes in our lineups. 4 teams on a bye this week. And for those of you who want the written version of this, as always, you can head over to pff.com and get access to Nate's waiver wire article with a PFF Plus subscription. And if you use the promo code that is started yesterday, I guess Monday, Black Friday is the promo code, and you get 40% off a PFF Plus subscription. So this is not just another sale. It is your edge for the rest of the season here. Obviously, every NFL and college team uses PFF data. Now you can too and get 40% off. So obviously, you deserve the same insight that the pros get. And this Black Friday, just $5.99 a month. If you're getting in now, you're setting yourself up to win, not just for the rest of this season, but all the way through next year. So whether it's, again, researching bets, setting lineups, sitting in the GM seat on draft day, or you just want to go beyond the box score, you can do it all. This is our biggest discount of the year, especially if you're a contending fantasy team in your fantasy league. You're looking to make that push for a championship. Maybe you haven't subscribed yet. This is the move to put you over the top in your fantasy leagues, giving you that edge to get over the finish line and bring home a fantasy championship. So don't wait. Use code Black Friday at subscribe.pff.com for 40% off a PFF Plus subscription. All right, Nate, let's get into our waiver targets here, and we'll start at the quarterback position. And a new name leading us off this week, that quarterback waiver wire, it's thin right now. Quarterbacks continue to drop like flies this season. We recently lost Michael Penix for the season, but also Kyler Murray on injured reserve. So Jacoby Brissett is an option as a potential matchup-based fill-in here for week 12 at least, Nate.
Oh, yeah. Quarterback is definitely a weird position right now. Like, I've been talking about JJ McCarthy on here for a while, and he just hasn't been performing that well, that I can't really continue to suggest picking him up despite his excellent schedule over the rest of the season. Bryce Young is the one who had an excellent week this past week, but when you look at all the other games he's had, last week was definitely the anomaly. So I wouldn't necessarily suggest picking him up and starting him in the near future. And then Aaron Rodgers is probably the one who's most consistently done well. That is still on the waiver wire. He's dealing with an injury right now. So that leaves Brissett, who just set the record for most completions in a game for an NFL quarterback in the regular season. It was a game without Marvin Harrison Jr. Zay Jones landed on injured reserve. They also had another backup wide receiver land on injured reserve last week. So they were really thin at receiver, but still Michael Wilson had the huge game. Trey McBride had a big game. Greg Dortch, good game as well. So Brissett has looked fairly good. He was, even before this week, playing well in terms of fantasy production, ranked eighth in fantasy points per game from week 6 to 10 at 21.4. This pushed him all the way to fourth in fantasy points per game since week 6 among quarterbacks. So he has been playing well, has a good matchup this week against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Pretty decent matchup over the rest of the season. Some of the games are unfavorable, but then finishes the season with the Cincinnati Bengals, who have allowed the second most fantasy points to quarterbacks this season. So assuming Brissett remains a starter, pick him up not just for this week, but potentially for that fantasy championship round.
Yeah, pretty impressive game from Brissett. 452 yards this week on 57 dropbacks. Like you said, completed 47 of those 57 dropbacks. Even with 2 picks in there, still finished as a top 5 fantasy quarterback this week. It was also his highest game of the year as well. Highest graded game this year as well, against the 49ers. 78.7 PFF grade, 77.5 passing grade. Like you said, gets the Jags this week. They obviously shut down the Chargers this past week for what was an awful Justin Herbert fantasy game. So hopefully that isn't the norm here, and probably more of a Chargers issue than a Jags defense thing. Like you said, Nate, on the year, the Jags have been a favorable matchup for opposing quarterbacks. So Jacoby Brissett hopefully will continue his momentum here into week 12. And then next is our only other quarterback on the list this week, and a common name who unfortunately, had a little bit of regression this past week. Joe Flacco of the Cincinnati Bengals has a shot to bounce back this week before Joe Burrow potentially returns to the lineup as well, Nate.
Usually I try to include at least 3 names, but Justin Fields was going to be the third name here, and he's no longer the starter for the New York Jets. And with him, it was the high upside. He has these huge games. He has these really bad games, but I'd rather take that risk than some of the other quarterbacks on the waiver wire. Now he's no longer an option. So we have Joe Flacco, who didn't have the greatest week this past week against the Pittsburgh Steelers, was excellent against them the first time around. This time, 23 of 40 passes, 199 yards, a touchdown, and an interception. So not the greatest passing game by the Bengals offense, but he's still, over the course of the season, has played very well since joining Cincinnati, has a decently favorable matchup, faces the Patriots and Ravens over the next 2 weeks. So at least 2 teams where the Bengals are going to have to pass the ball a ton against. So even if the quality of the defense is decent, the volume of passes is what's going to be most important. And Flacco should have a very high volume of passes. Then at that point, we expect Joe Burrow to be back sooner rather than later. We should get at least 1 more week of Flacco. I wouldn't be surprised if it's 2 more weeks of Flacco, just because Burrow's coming back fairly quickly from this injury. But it wouldn't be surprising if Flacco's only a starter for another week or 2. So only get Flacco if you are looking for a quarterback for the short term.
Yeah, no, it makes sense, right? And like you said, this past week was his worst fantasy performance since joining the Bengals, unfortunately. And yeah, we'll see what happens this week. Obviously, Jamar Hawk-Tua Chase is suspended this week, so that also kind of hurts his potential. But again, a decent matchup, not many great options out there on the waiver wire. So hopefully Joe Flacco can give us 1 more great fantasy game this year before Joe Burrow returns. But let's move on to the running backs now, Nate. And this group is led by Washington Commanders running back Chris Rodriguez, who took 15 carries for 79 yards on Sunday morning in Spain. They're heading to a bye week in week 12, but it looks like Rodriguez is kind of the clear leader in the backfield right now.
He kind of took over the starting job 2 weeks ago, but then he got an injury late in the game. So Rodriguez wasn't as high of a priority because we just weren't sure what the extent of the injury was. But Rodriguez was able to get back in the lineup just fine. He started the game, played all the early down snaps on the first 2 drives, then kind of rotated with Krosky Merritt throughout the rest of the game. Obviously, if you need a running back specifically for this week, since we do have 4 teams on bye this week, he is not the one to pick up because he is one of the teams on a bye. But the Commanders have an excellent schedule for running backs over those last 5 weeks of the fantasy season. Particularly in the fantasy playoffs, the Commanders face their 3 division rivals, the Giants, Cowboys, 2 of the teams that have allowed the most fantasy points to running backs, at least when teams are willing to run against them, unlike the Raiders last night. So I expect Washington to run the ball more than the Raiders did. So I think Rodriguez, assuming he remains a starter, which looks to be the case considering he's played relatively well, I expect him to have some pretty big games, particularly in the fantasy playoffs. So just depends what you need at running back. If you need someone in the short term, go to someone else. But if you are looking ahead to the long run, Rodriguez is the top player I'd consider.
Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, obviously on a bye this week, tougher matchup in week 13 against a very good Broncos defense. But like you said, the fact that we have, a lead back here so widely available on waiver wires right now is definitely something we can take advantage of, even if you don't plan on starting him just yet. But if he holds that lead role, then you've got yourself a viable starting option here if Rodriguez does hold that role and into the fantasy playoffs. All right. Next name on the list is Emmanuel Wilson of the Green Bay Packers because we lost Josh Jacobs to a knee injury. Shout out MetLife. Apparently he's week to week or day to day, depending on who you're listening to. We'll see. But obviously another high end fantasy starter. He's like RB7 on the year right now. So it'll be up to Emmanuel Wilson to hold down the fort while Jacobs is out for however long that'll be.
Yeah, it was said to be a not serious injury, but it seems like this year that is the phrase for anything that's not out for the rest of the season. So it's unclear how long Josh Jacobs will be out. I would expect him to at least miss this upcoming game, in which case Emmanuel Wilson will be the lead running back. We saw very early in the season, Chris Brooks was the primary backup, but basically since week 3, Emmanuel Wilson has been the clear backup for Green Bay. And we saw this past week after Josh Jacobs went down with an injury, Emmanuel Wilson took the vast majority of snaps. Chris Brooks taking a couple snaps on third downs, a couple snaps on early downs, but Wilson seeing a role even better than what Josh Jacobs is typically used to, especially since Jacobs had been dealing with a different injury early in the season, was limiting his playing time a little bit here and there, was still getting plenty of carries in those games, but Wilson was getting plenty of experience on the field. So expect Wilson to be the lead running back for Green Bay. I wouldn't spend the rest of your fab if we do find out that Jacobs lands on injured reserve or something like that today, which I doubt will happen. But Packers have a pretty okay schedule for running backs the rest of the way. Face the Ravens during the fantasy championship round, and the Ravens defense has been susceptible in the run game, even though the defense in general has improved throughout the year. So not that I expect Wilson to remain the starting running back that long, but if he is, he could be a league winner from that perspective. But more so, if you need a running back in the short term, Wilson should have a pretty big role in the Packers offense.
Yeah. And he had 11 carries for 40 yards, nothing amazing. But the main thing is that, like you said, he should get that goal line usage now with Jacobs out, which is such a big part of Josh Jacobs' fantasy value is that touchdown scoring. And Wilson did score this week as well. Playing on a top offense here being the key. And yeah, Jacobs likely going to miss at least this week, right? So Wilson should definitely be added in the majority of leagues here with the potential to get even more starts after this if Jacobs is out longer. Okay, we also lost Jaylen Warren to an ankle injury this week, Nate. So Kenneth Gainwell could once again be a starting fantasy option if Warren is out. We saw Gainwell deliver high-end fantasy production last time Warren missed time this season. So another solid option here, assuming Warren is out.
Yeah, at this point, Gainwell is someone I'd pick up just to have on the bench to see what ends up happening, because Jaylen Warren did mention sometime after the game that he would have been able to come back had they needed him. So that was something that was worth noting. I know a lot of people are speculating that Gainwell could be the starter regardless because he had such a good game, but it was mostly a good game from a fantasy perspective. He did really well as a receiving back, but Jaylen Warren still did excellent as a runner, and he has been the primary runner. And we have seen the Steelers kind of shift their backfield early in the season. We saw Warren and Gainwell used pretty interchangeably. More recently, it's been Warren as more of a clear early down back, Gainwell more of a clear passing down back. And that's the role that they had in the first half this week. And they just had a really long 2-minute drill. They've had a lot of third downs in that game. So even before the injury, we were seeing more Gainwell than usual, but that was just how the game script was flowing, not the Steelers changing their philosophy. So not expecting Gainwell to be the starter, assuming Warren is back, which it sounds like he'd be able to. But Gainwell has been someone that's had a lot of standalone value this season, even with Warren healthy. And the Steelers have a lot of difficult opponents upcoming games against the Bills and the Ravens, for example, two teams where the Steelers could be falling behind and needing to pass the ball a lot, in which case Gainwell would be on the field a lot for those games. So I'd still pick him up even if we find out Warren is fine. I just wouldn't necessarily want him in my starting lineup this week unless we find out Warren can't play.
Yeah, we'll see what happens with Warren's availability. Obviously, he's missed time earlier this season. It was week 4 or whatever it was, and then obviously a chunk here of week 11. So, yeah, both games resulted in top 5 fantasy finishes for Kenneth Gainwell. So definitely somebody that we need to keep an eye on here. And then Nate, the Giants' backfield without Cam Scatterbo has been the duo of Tyrone Tracy and Devin Singletary. And while Tracy has led the team in carries here, sans Scatterbo, Singletary could be closing the gap a bit, and he did score twice this week as well.
Yeah, Tracy has been the lead back on normal early down situations. Tracy had 31 snaps last week compared to 17 by Singletary. But the big thing is Singletary has taken 100% of the goal line and short yardage snaps over the last 2 weeks. So the fact that it's been 18 plays in a row where Singletary has been the one makes it pretty clear that Singletary is going to be the running back in those situations going forward. And that's led Singletary over these past 3 weeks combined to score more fantasy points than Tracy, just because of those touchdowns. So I think Singletary has some of that high upside possibility because of those touchdowns. They've also, even though it's been Tracy with the clear lead, they've been decently close together in terms of how many times they're running the ball each. So that also helps Singletary, and he's been used a decent amount in passing situations. So that should help Singletary's receiving work, even though it was Tracy who had a pretty good game this past week as a receiver. So Giants face the Lions and Patriots over the next 2 weeks, followed by a bye week. So Singletary probably isn't going to help many people reach the fantasy playoffs because I don't see the Giants scoring a lot of points against the Lions and the Patriots. But during the fantasy playoffs, games against the Commanders, the Vikings, the Raiders, all teams with losing records right now, all teams where the Giants could be scoring a decent amount of points, in which case Singletary could be scoring some touchdowns. So if you end up making the playoffs and might need a running back because of injury situations or just whatever else is going on with your team, Singletary could be a fine desperation play in hopes of scoring a touchdown, especially if you're an underdog in one of those games.
Yeah, the goal to go carries are in the short yardage situations obviously huge here for Singletary. And then, yeah, the slight edge on third downs this week, definitely promising as well. So, yeah, even if the usage does remain close with him and Tracy, there's some high value opportunities there to return some fantasy value for Devin Singletary. Another back with some decent enough opportunities on some of those higher value downs. Tajay Spears of the Tennessee Titans dominating the true passing downs for a team that we do expect to be playing from behind and passing a fair bit this year, Nate.
Yeah, the Titans just had their bye week a week ago, so I had hoped we would see a little bit more Spears on early downs. That didn't end up being the case. It was a very normal distribution of snaps for the Titans running backs this past week, where Spears took nearly all of the third downs, all of the 2-minute drill, and saw a decent amount of the early down work. So Spears has averaged 10.2 PPR points per game since returning to his usual role. That is right at the borderline of being an RB2, RB3, a flex option in there. So he is not the highest upside option that you can get off the waiver wire. But if you think you might need a running back in your starting lineup in the short term, Spears is someone that I would definitely consider. If you are one of these teams that you've already locked up a playoff spot and you're looking to get more high upside players on your bench, I would look elsewhere at running back rather than Spears, but it just depends what your team needs this time of year.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? Like he had a solid game for PPR, and that's with doing nothing on the ground this week, right? 8 points in PPR leagues, which like you said, it's not bad for a running back who had just 3 rushing yards and 0 touchdowns. I mean, 8 points is more than what we got from Jamar Chase this week. So sometimes we're really disappointed with players who score under 10 points. Other times it's kind of a pleasant surprise. It's all about expectations after all, Nate. All right, in Tampa Bay, we also had Bucky Irving, or almost had Bucky Irving back this week, but instead we have to wait a little bit longer, which is too bad because Sean Tucker went off against the Bills, over 100 rushing yards and 3 total touchdowns, just rubbing it into Bucky fantasy managers who have been patiently waiting for his return. So tell us about Tucker in the meantime while we wait on Irving's returning.
Yeah, while he's been out, initially we saw Rashad White as the clear lead back, but over the past couple weeks, we've seen Tucker see roughly as many carries as White, and then we saw the change this past week. White has remained the third down back, the 2 minute drill back. They had 18 snaps in those situations this past week. White took all 18 of them. And we did see Bucky Irving return to practice, so I wouldn't be all that surprised if Irving is potentially back this week, which does put a big dent in Sean Tucker's fantasy value because once Irving is back, I expect Irving to lead the team in snaps. I would expect White to be second in snaps because White would continue to take some of those passing down situations, and that's where Irving is weakest. So I think Tucker is a great option if we find out Irving is going to miss more time, but the Buccaneers also face the Rams next week, which is a team where they probably aren't going to have a ton of success on the run game. They'll probably need to pass the ball a decent amount with how the Rams have been playing recently. So, Irving, and then I think they have their bye shortly after that. So, or we should see Irving back in the lineup by week 13, I'd expect. So, Tucker is someone that is high on the waiver wire in a lot of other places because of his potential, but I think Bucky Irving will at least be the lead back when he's back. There's a chance we see like a 3-person timeshare where Tucker is sharing backfield, in which case you still probably don't want him in your fantasy starting lineup. So I am mostly considering Tucker if we find out Irving is going to continue to miss time. And so far, we haven't gotten fully straight answers of how long he's been out, and that's been true for a couple of these Buccaneers players. So there is definitely a chance that Irving misses more time than we expect.
Yeah, it's possible, right? And like at the very least, even if Bucky is back in week 12, like it's possible that he's just eased back in since look, Sean Tucker has played well. Plus, like you said, they have Rashad White as well. So, they can afford to be patient with Bucky Irving for at least a week or two. They've obviously been cautious with him thus far. So I don't see why that would change here in the next couple of weeks or so, heading into their eventual bye week. But yeah, Sean Tucker could have definitely have more value if Bucky misses this week as well. So,
and I did
Nate,
misspeak about the bye. They already had their bye week, so
do they
it's
have it?
Irving.
Okay.
But also, like the Buccaneers, I would mention have been cautious, but they also had a clear lead in the division before, and now that lead in the division has shrunk. So I wouldn't be surprised if they might be a little less cautious about those players returning now that they only have, I believe, a half game lead in the division currently.
Okay. Yeah, I don't remember the Bucks bye. I don't know why. Anyways, okay. So, week 9. Okay. Well, interesting. It was only a couple weeks ago. There we go. Short memories. All right. So, Nate, Bam Knight of the Arizona Cardinals also found the end zone this week. We don't know if Trey Benson will be back this week or not, but even still, Amari DiMercado suffered a high ankle sprain this week, so potentially room for Knight to keep making an impact here either way.
Yeah, early in the game, we saw Knight and DiMercado kind of share the early down work, share the carries. DiMercado continuing to play on third downs, but he suffered his injury pretty early on in the game. Then we saw Michael Carter get much more involved since Carter took over as the passing down back and as the backup on early downs. We have gotten word that DiMercado probably is not going to play this upcoming week. So that means that if Trey Benson misses yet another game, we should expect Bam Knight to be the starter for yet another game. It hasn't been a ton of fantasy production out of Knight. The Cardinals stuck with the passing game this past week. So a pretty risky option, and it's a tough matchup upcoming, but the Cardinals are a team where they need to run the ball sometimes, and pretty much any running back who has a chance of being a fan or being a starter on their team deserves a shot of being on fantasy rosters because all of those running backs typically see at least some production. So while it's not the most exciting situation, some teams might need any running back who is a starter this week. And it looks like Knight will be the starter for another week, unless we find out in the next day or two that Benson has at least returned to practice. But there's also a chance Benson returns to practice this week and practices throughout the week and still doesn't play this week. So Knight's someone that I'd pick up, and there's a chance he can be in fantasy starting lineups for yet another week.
Yep. And then Nate, we also have By Gerber, who carried the ball 15 times for 74 yards for the Jaguars and to score this past week. Now, the Jags, they had this game well in hand against the Chargers. So do you think this was more due to game script, or is there more than just a handcuff role here for Tootin in this backfield worth targeting for fantasy?
I think it was kind of a hot hand kind of thing where Tootin was playing well, so then they kept playing him. But I'm not sure that necessarily means that they will keep playing him long term. We did see him suffer an injury in this game, which definitely hurts his case a little bit. But Tootin's someone where I think ETN's been the better runner so far this season over the course of the entire season. So I would not be surprised if ETN remains a starter going forward. I think we would need another very solid game out of Tootin or two solid games out of him before they consider making the change and making Tootin the starter. The Jaguars' schedule isn't the best for running backs. They face the Colts, the Jets, and the Broncos during the fantasy playoffs. Some teams where I expect the Jaguars to be falling behind in the game and having to pass the ball more, which isn't necessarily what Tootin's been doing a lot of this season. So I think he is a fine player to pick up when you consider this is the point of the season where only 8 teams have bye weeks left. You hopefully have a solid starting lineup. Hopefully you don't have to switch with players on your bench that often. So then you're considering your bench spots of players who have high upside and could have a huge end of the season. And there's a chance that Tootin becomes the starter. So while I wouldn't spend thinking that Tootin's going to be the guy in Jacksonville going forward, I would be perfectly fine picking him up just in case he becomes the guy, since there's not that many rookies where there's a clear chance where they could see a significant jump in playing time this season without an injury.
Makes sense. So there you go. Still just Beischel, RB, Tootin in Jacksonville for now. And now the Chase Brown handcuff in Cincinnati, Nate, we've talked about this spot for a while now. Samaje Perine still holding down that role.
Yeah, he is currently dealing with an injury, missed this past week. If anything, this past week further show that Perine's the handcuff when he's healthy, because the Bengals didn't just turn to Taj Brooks as the backup. They rotated between him and a practice squad guy. So clear that they aren't fully sold on Taj Brooks right now. And Chase Brown played much more than he usually does this season. So good news for Perine once he is healthy again. The Bengals also face teams like the Ravens twice and the Bills late in the season. So teams where I expect the Bengals to be falling behind and needing to pass the ball a lot. So once Perine is healthy, he should see a lot of that playing time. And he was receiving more carries right before he got hurt. So he was getting more involved in the run game. So first off, he's a great handcuff option if something were to happen to Chase Brown. But even if nothing happens to him, if you're in one of these deeper 14, 16 team leagues and might need a running back, there's a chance Perine has some pretty nice games over the rest of the season, even if Brown stays healthy.
Good. And then lastly, coming off a bye week, Devin Neal of the New Orleans Saints, he remains Alvin Kamara's handcuff as well.
Yeah. So like I was saying earlier with Tootin, this is the point of the season where you want to get some high upside players on your bench. If you're looking for one of them, Devin Neal is someone that I would consider as well. I'd expect Kamara to remain the starter over the rest of the season. It looked pretty clear that he was the main running back right before the bye week. But if something were to happen to Kamara, then Neal would be the guy. If the Saints decide, hey, we're out of the playoff race, let's see what we have in Neal for a game or two. There's a chance Neal could have a very big role in those games. And the Saints have an excellent schedule for running backs over the rest of the season. Mentioned in the 5 to add, 5 to drop, 5 to buy low, 5 to sell high, that Kamara is someone I'd be looking to trade for right now, because the Saints schedule is that good. A bunch of teams with losing records in there. So teams where the Saints can stay competitive and keep running the ball in those games. It is the last week to make trades in fantasy football in a lot of leagues. So if you needed a quarterback, a trade's probably a best option. But also if you need help anywhere else on your roster and you're not finding what you need off the waiver wire, now is probably the last week that you can make a trade. So definitely find out when your league's trade deadline is and figure things out from there. But if you're looking for a running back off the waivers, Neal is someone I would definitely consider.
There you go. All right, before we go into the wide receivers, I want to let you all know that this episode is brought to you by Fabric by Gerber Life. Parenting is filled with high-pressure decisions, and it can be difficult to tell if we've made the right choice for our kids' future. But here's a simple decision you can make today that could have a meaningful impact on your kids' future. Opening a UGMA Kids Investment account with Fabric to start their investment journey early and give them a financial head start. Fabric by Gerber Life was designed by parents for parents to make it easy to plan for and manage your family's financial path. With a kids investment account from Fabric, you can start investing in your child's future today. It's all online, and setting up an account can take you just 5 minutes. Get started investing with as little as $1 a day, then manage your child's account and monitor their investments right from your phone. There are no contribution limits, multiple tax advantages, and SIPC insured up to $500,000, plus no commission fees and just a low flat monthly maintenance fee. Fabric has partnered with Gerber Life, trusted by millions of families like yours for over 50 years. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their family. Start investing in your child today at meetfabric.com/PFFNFL. That's meetfabric.com/PFFNFL, MEET, fabric.com/PFFNFL. Portfolios managed by Fort Washington Investment Advisors, Inc. Additional services provided by Apex Clearing Corporation. All investing is subject to risk. Learn more at meetfabric.com. All right, on to the wide receivers now. And leading us off, as he did last week, Alec Pierce of the Indianapolis Colts, coming off a bye week, but he's been a big part of this Colts offense all year, Nate. And his most recent game in week 10, he finally found the end zone as well. So maybe the floodgates could be open here for Alec Pierce going forward.
Yeah, we've talked about him a bit at the top of the wide receiver section for a good month or so now. Has averaged 14.9 PPR points per game since week 7. So that is generally good for a wide receiver too. So plenty of the times when you're looking for a wide receiver off the waiver wire, you're looking for someone who's a wide receiver 3, a flex option. Pierce has been even better than that recently. Worth noting, the Colts do have some difficult matchups over the next 2 weeks, but the schedule during the fantasy playoffs is much better. So I think Pierce is someone where if you have already clinched the fantasy playoffs or are close to it, might not want Pierce in my lineup this upcoming week, but I think Pierce can be an excellent option for your fantasy starting lineups in the fantasy playoffs.
Nice. Yeah, gets the Chiefs this week, but he's been really good in a great offense this season as Shane Steichen's deep man there, and Daniel Jones continues to look for him as well, and still do for more touchdowns in the weeks ahead as well. Okay, the Cardinals have been we've actually represented at quarterback, running back, and wide receiver now on this waiver target list. Nate, they were without Marvin Harrison Jr. this week, and go figure, Michael Wilson goes out and basically doubles up Marvin Harrison Jr.'s best receiving yardage total this year in a game by putting up 185 yards against the Niners. Pretty hard to ignore Wilson as a potential option, especially if Harrison is out again, Nate.
Yeah, there are plenty of times where we see a wide receiver not do much and then maybe get 100 yards off of 4 catches or something, and we're fine to ignore them off the waiver wire because we know that was just a one-game anomaly. But when you catch 15 passes for 185 yards, you can't ignore that off the waiver wire. Wilson is someone who was decently highly drafted. We thought highly of him, especially in his rookie year. He was on the waiver list for a number of weeks there, has shown some sparks throughout his career, just hasn't had that high of a target rate. So we haven't been able to consider Wilson that much, but we saw him have the huge game, and especially if Marvin Harrison Jr. continues to miss some time, then Wilson's going to be the top option in the offense. Mentioned before when we were talking about Brissett, Zay Jones also out for the season, so Wilson had been seeing a decent amount of work in the slot, now playing primarily out wide with Greg Dortch as their slot receiver. In this past game, Wilson was playing a lot of the X receiver role, which is typically Marvin Harrison's role, so not sure how much that played into it versus just playing on the outside. Cardinals have a pretty rough schedule during the fantasy playoffs, but upcoming Jacksonville, Tampa Bay, Los Angeles Rams again over the next 3 weeks. So a number of games where the Cardinals should be passing the ball a lot, should have secondaries where they can take at least some advantage of. So if you're looking for that wide receiver in the short run, I think Wilson has a chance to be a fantasy starter for another couple of weeks, especially if Harrison misses more time.
Yeah. And yeah, that's the thing, right? If Harrison misses more time, because the Cardinals passing offense, it's mostly led us to like only have McBride and Marvin Harrison Jr. as like viable fantasy options every week. But look, if Jacoby Brissett is going to drop back 50 plus times per game, then maybe Wilson could be more involved, even if Marvin Harrison Jr. returns next week. Obviously, it's hard to actually expect that level of volume going forward, but at least we know they're capable of it, because it didn't really look that way with Kyler, who never threw for more than 220 yards in a game this season. And Brissett has exceeded that number in all of his starts this year, averaging 314 passing yards per game, which is pretty damn good for Jacoby and his receivers. So definitely an option. Another player who had a great fantasy performance this past week, Nate, Christian Watson scored 2 receiving touchdowns for the Green Bay Packers, caught 1 touchdown from Jordan Love, got another one from Malik Willis. So Watson finding some success here recently. So you think he has a chance to keep it going here for the Pack?
It seems like the Packers dealing with a ton of injuries across the board on offense. Tucker Kraft out for the season, so that helps the wide receivers in general. From the wide receiver room, we've seen Romeo Doubs, Watson, Dontavian Wicks, Matthew Golden, Xavier Williams all appear on the injury report in recent weeks, and then Jaden Reed as well remains on injured reserve. So their top 6 wide receivers all dealing with at least some kind of injury. This past week was the healthiest that we have seen the wide receiver room in some time, and that everyone outside of Jaden Reed was playing. So Watson wasn't someone I was considering a ton because I thought there'd be more of a rotation once the wide receivers were back. But Matthew Golden was the clear wide receiver 4 for them. Dontavian Wicks, the clear wide receiver 3. Watson was playing basically as much snaps as he saw the week before when Golden wasn't playing, and pretty near where he was at his very best last season. So I wouldn't be surprised if once Jaden Reed is back, that impacts more of the other wide receivers than it ends up impacting Watson. So it seems like he has a pretty clear role in the Packers offense, which is surprising considering the number of players they have at wide receiver. But he had those 2 touchdowns this past week. He's been one of their deep threats for the offense. So an opportunity to make big plays any given play. So a chance that Watson continues to be a big part of this Packers offense, especially if Josh Jacobs misses time. They could be passing the ball more. The injuries at all the other positions just means more targets for Watson going forward.
Yeah, injuries have definitely been frustrating for the Packers as well this year. And look, the injuries for Watson have kind of been a killer for him so far in his career, but we've definitely seen flashes of his talent a fair bit when he's in the lineup. Just needs to be able to stay there, right? And deliver some consistent production. Maybe we can see him be that weekly fantasy option since the Packers are without Tucker Kraft for the rest of the year. And he at least looked good here in week 11. So next up, Cedric Tillman led the Browns in receiving yards this past week, Nate. They've needed someone to emerge as a consistent receiving option this season. Is there a chance that Tillman could be that guy for them?
The big reason he is here is because the Browns' schedule for wide receivers is excellent over the next 6 weeks. It's been a decently tough schedule over the first 2/3 of the season, but these next 6 opponents all rank in the bottom 12 in preventing fantasy points to wide receivers. So 6 straight great matchups for him, and Tillman was the lead receiver for them this past week. Continues to be a clear top wide receiver for them. Isn't seeing quite as many offensive snaps as we're used to him seeing, but he also just returned from his injury. Saw an uptick in snaps this past week. Expect those snaps to continue to increase going forward. So not someone I'd probably put in my fantasy starting lineup this week, but I think there's a chance he could have a big end of the season.
Yeah, definitely possible. I mean, he started the year with a touchdown in back-to-back games. Obviously, then spent some time on IR for a chunk of the year. But maybe now that he's back in the lineup, and then that role continues to grow a little bit, he could be a contributor for them on a consistent basis. But Nate, let's get into some maybe I guess more speculative ads here. Although the first one pretty good so far, starting with Luther Burden, because his role has been growing a bit here in the latter weeks of the season.
Oh, yeah. We saw 2 weeks ago, DJ Moore was dealing with an injury. So Burden saw his highest percentage of offensive snaps. And then this past week, he took over the slot role from Olamide Zaccheaus. So Burden finally became that number 3 wide receiver for Chicago. Chicago had found a bunch of different ways to get him on the field before. They had 4 wide receiver sets. They also had 1 wide receiver sets where Burden was the primary wide receiver in those personnel groupings. So it was just a couple snaps and a bunch of different personnel groupings. This was the first time where he was the clear player in 3 wide receiver sets. His yards per route run have been excellent this season. So there's a chance that he could become the top wide receiver for Chicago down the stretch. Rome Odunze has had some great games, but he's also had some games where he really hasn't been involved. I think Burden would need to see an even further increase in his role before I would trust him in fantasy starting lineups. But I think that's certainly possible. I think the big thing is 2 wide receiver sets, which Chicago runs a lot of 2 wide receiver sets because they have the 2 tight ends. I think there's a chance Burden could continue cutting into DJ Moore's playing time there. So Moore wouldn't have to lose his role completely. It would just be potentially like a 50-50 split for the two of them in two wide receiver sets, in which case Moore and Burden would see pretty equal amounts of playing time. And that could be enough to make Burden a fantasy starter. So again, this is the point of the year where you want to get those high upside guys on your bench that you might not trust starting right now. But I'd see the path for Burden to be a fantasy starter the rest of the way. So pick him up now before he gets to that point.
Yeah, and look, it's another team, right, where we're hoping for we get somebody with who can be more consistent, because you're right. Odunze, DJ Moore, they haven't really been that this year. So who knows if Burden will get there. But as far as players worth betting on that are widely available, Burden definitely makes the most sense here. For waiver targets available in over 90% of leagues right now. All right, another rookie getting more work here recently and being relatively productive with his snaps as well. Jaden Higgins of the Houston Texans, Nate.
Yeah, we saw early in the season his role was very stagnant. He was a primary wide receiver in two wide receiver sets and not playing much in three wide receiver sets. The middle early parts of the season, Nico Collins was dealing with an injury, so he saw an increase in snaps. But now everyone is healthy again, and despite that, Higgins' playing time has been on the rise these past couple weeks. He's been cutting into Xavier Hutchinson's time in three wide receiver sets, so that's been the big thing. Higgins would kind of need to take over that role in order for Higgins to be a fantasy starter, but there's a chance that happens. We saw a week ago Woody Marks completely take over the backfield for Houston, for example. So Houston has shown that they're willing to make significant changes to their rotation for a rookie player. So I think there's a chance that happens sometime in these next couple weeks. So if you pick up Higgins now, you have him before that happens, rather than Higgins having a big game as a starter and everyone trying to pick him up at the same time.
Yeah, for sure. And look, back-to-back games too with over 40 receiving yards for him. His previous 8 games had all been under 40 yards. So positive production developments for the second round rookie as well. Back-to-back games with 7 targets as well is really nice. He's now hit that mark in 3 of his last 4 games. So definitely improving situation there for Jaden Higgins. Okay, Brandon Ayuk is up next, potentially close to returning here, according to some reports. So worth an ad, you reckon?
Yeah, it's another just speculative ad. He's been dropped in more and more leagues each and every week, so his rostership continues to go down. They already announced that he's not returning to practice this week, so I expect that rostership to go down rather than up again. But the 49ers have a great schedule down the stretch, especially during the fantasy playoffs. So even if Ayuk isn't returning this week, ideally he returns to practice next week, maybe needs a week or two, and then he potentially returns to the lineup and is the top wide receiver for San Francisco. There's a chance that other wide receivers have a big game in those weeks, but Ayuk was a top 15 fantasy wide receiver at his best. And the 49ers might be waiting for him to return until he can be his very best. They could be that cautious with him right now. So I don't think it's likely that Ayuk's a fantasy starter during the fantasy playoffs, but there's a chance that he could have some big games there. So I'd still consider him over a lot of other options who we've seen who the players are, and I wouldn't expect big games out of those players during the fantasy playoffs.
That's fair. All right, some of the real deep options now, Nate, and you've included Tyrell Shavers of the Buffalo Bills, rostered in just 0.1% of ESPN leagues, but he put up 90 yards and a touchdown in week 11. So the question, of course, is this sustainable, Nate?
It's possible. The difficult thing is this is the Bills offense where they spread the ball to a ton of different players, and that has been the case for a while now. So I'm not sure how much I can trust Shavers, but we could see an increase in playing time. This was the first time where he played over 50% of snaps. Was a weird week in that Keon Coleman was a healthy and active for disciplinary reasons. That led Gabe Davis to be the X receiver for Buffalo. Joshua Palmer, who typically plays the Z receiver role, played a little bit more X, so that allowed Shavers to see more playing time. But even though I expect Keon Coleman to be active this upcoming week, would not be surprised if Keon Coleman does not see the same amount of snaps that he had been seeing throughout the rest of the season, in which case Shavers could continue to see more playing time. And I think there's a path for Shavers to lead the Bills in offensive snaps going forward among the wide receivers. Also worth mentioning, Don Kincaid's been out, so that also probably contributes to the wide receivers seeing more targets in general. But the coaches have had positive things to say about Shavers in general that could continue to get him more involved in the offense. So he is just a speculative ad, someone I wouldn't want in fantasy starting lineups, but potentially he is playing well enough that the Bills consider him their top outside wide receiver going forward. And Keon Coleman had a great week one. We have seen good games out of their outside receivers before, so a chance Shavers can put a couple of those good games together.
Yeah, and you said it, right? Like the Bills, they've spread the ball around a ton this year, more than most teams. And I'm sure, once Coleman and Kincaid come back, it probably makes things a little bit messier, like you said, but he at least played well, Shavers, and maybe has earned himself more playing time since, the rest of the Bills receiving core, they've I guess struggled to gain any kind of consistent traction this season. So definitely possible. Now in Pittsburgh, Nate, Calvin Austin, he has been operating as the team's clear wide receiver too, but that might have changed this week as Roman Wilson now becomes a waiver wire target.
Yeah, we saw a clear change this past week with Roman Wilson overtaking Calvin Austin on the depth chart. Wilson more consistently playing in 3 wide receiver sets. It was kind of a rotation of guys in 2 wide receiver sets, but Wilson was seeing a lot of snaps there as well. So we've seen Wilson, that uptick in snaps kind of over time, but Calvin Austin, a clear decrease in snaps this week, a dramatic decrease compared to every other week this season that he's been healthy. So a lot depends on the Steelers' offense and how well they're playing and everything. So we haven't seen these huge games out of Wilson yet, but the fact that he saw a significant increase in playing time could come with more targets down the line. So especially if you're in one of these deeper leagues where Wilson is very widely available, I think he's a good speculative person to add on your bench because Rodgers does have a history of throwing a lot to slot receivers and Z receivers as well. So there's a chance Wilson could see a lot of targets down the line.
Yeah, and we'll see what happens with Aaron Rodgers. I think it's Mason Rudolph at quarterback this week, but Rodgers could potentially be back here. And then lastly, at wide receiver, we lost Drake London, it seems, for a little bit. So just another top fantasy option gone. Nate, you've included Kaderil Hodge on the list this week.
Oh, yeah. Anytime that we have seen Drake London miss any significant time, Kaderil Hodge has been the clear replacement. That's been true when London's missed a couple plays here and there or needs a break for a couple plays. And we saw that after London went down at the end of the game, it was Hodge playing the rest of the game for Atlanta. Has never been a wide receiver to have these huge target rates or anything. So that's a little concerning, but he is playing in a role that's been highly productive for Atlanta this season. Primarily expect this to mean more targets for guys like Kyle Pitts or Darnell Mooney, but I think Hodge is someone who should see a decent number of targets going forward. So again, if you're in some of these deeper leagues and need a wide receiver, and the waiver wire hasn't been very kind this season, a couple of good guys that you can pick up this week.
All right, let's wrap it up with some tight ends now, Nate. Still led by rookie top 10 pick Colston Loveland. Available in about 60% of leagues still.
Oh, yeah, still a little concerned about his playing time because Cole Kmet is still there, but was up to around 75% of offensive snaps. They stuck a lot with their 2 tight end sets this past week, so that was good to see. Still seeing a good number of targets, which is also helpful. Chicago faces the Pittsburgh Steelers this week. They've allowed the 5th most fantasy points to tight ends this season, so Loveland's a good player. One, if you need a tight end specifically for this week, but also long-term, just good to add these rookie players who could have a huge end of the season. There's a chance that Loveland sees a jump in playing time, just like we just saw Burden see a pretty decent jump in playing time this past week.
Yeah, Cole Kmet, he led the team in receiving yards this week, so he continues to kind of be the biggest detriment to Loveland's fantasy value, but we know the talent is there. We could see that potentially shift as well. And Nate, if it says anything about the tight ends that are available off waiver wires this week, Darren Waller is number 2 on the list here. Still hoping that he'll be back to take advantage of a favorable fantasy playoff schedule.
Yeah, he keeps getting closer and closer to returning, so he'll keep moving up this list. Wouldn't be surprised if he is the top player on this list in the near future, because he is someone who was averaging 15.2 PPR points per game during the 3 games where he was able to start and finish the game, which is excellent for a fantasy starting tight end. This is what we see out of the top players at the position. So if Waller can be healthy down the stretch and continue playing as well as he played early in the season, faces the Steelers and the Bengals, 2 of the bottom 5 teams in preventing fantasy points to tight ends. So excellent matchups during the fantasy playoffs. I could see Waller having huge games those weeks. They haven't had a ton of production out of their tight ends since Waller has been injured. So I think there's a chance he can be in fantasy starting lineups and really help some fantasy managers who have been hurting at tight end recently.
And then another interesting name here on the tight end waiver wire target list, just because of his fantasy success already this season, Juwan Johnson might be available in a decent amount of leagues coming off the team's bye week as well.
Yeah, we've had some good news and bad news for Johnson recently. One, the Saints have started to trust their other tight ends a little bit more in terms of playing time. We saw Foster Moreau take a lot of the early down snaps in single tight end sets before the bye week, but those are also a lot of run plays. So that didn't hurt Johnson's percentage of routes that he was on the field for all that much. And then the Saints recently traded Rashid Shaheed away. So Johnson now moves up the target priority list because they don't trust their wide receivers as much. So we saw Johnson have a pretty strong week before the bye week, 4 catches, 92 yards, and a touchdown. The Saints, okay schedule for tight ends the rest of the way. They have a rough matchup against the Atlanta Falcons next week, but then they have 2 great matchups against the Dolphins and the Panthers. So I could see Johnson having some big games the rest of the way, someone that look at your schedule, look at the tight ends you already have and which weeks you might want to start certain guys, and that'll probably go a long way in determining which of these tight ends you might want to pick up off the waiver wire.
Yeah, for sure. And another tight end who was, I mean, continues to be a pretty big part of the Seattle offense here. AJ Barner, I think he had 11 targets, 10 catches, 70 yards this past week. So AJ Barner's another guy that's pretty widely available here.
Yeah, there are a lot of things to like about Barner. We just haven't seen it kind of all get put together for any kind of stretch of games. We saw him score a couple of touchdowns early in the season. We've seen him grade very well. He's one of the top options in Seattle's passing game. And he's also been the one doing the tush push for them, which led to a touchdown 2 weeks ago. So ideally, that can lead to more touchdowns going forward. The big thing is Seattle does not throw as many passes as most teams, and Jackson Smith-Njigba has a very high percentage of that target share. They just added Rashid Shaheed, so if anything, there's going to be more targets to wide receivers going forward. Just needs that wide receiver room to get healthy, so that really hurts Barner's opportunity for targets, but there's a lot of things to like, and hopefully they see what he did this past week and get him more targets going forward. Hopefully continue to use him with the tush push, potentially more at the 1 yard line, which can lead to some more touchdowns. So if everything is going right for Barner, he is a top 5 fantasy tight end. We just haven't seen many of the things go right at the same time for him this year.
Yeah. And then last name on the list here, Brenton Strange of the Jacksonville Jaguars. He should be back. His mandatory 4 games on injured reserve is now up.
Yeah, he was doing decent before the injury, averaging 9.3 PPR points per game over the first 4 weeks of the season. That's not quite what you want out of your tight end one, but it's fairly close. And he wasn't scoring any touchdowns, so all it would have taken is a touchdown in there, and he would have been a low end tight end one during the first 4 weeks of the season. He returned to practice this past week. I think was on a limited basis, so wasn't quite ready to return. Would not be at all surprised if Strange is back in the Jaguars starting lineup this week. Like all of the tight ends on this list has a couple of favorable matchups over the rest of the year. Most notably faces the Colts twice over these next 6 games. They've allowed the 6th most fantasy points to tight ends, and teams are generally passing a lot against Indianapolis trying to keep up with their offense. So we could see a couple of big games out of Strange. One of those is also the fantasy championship week. So Strange could be a good player if you might need a tight end during fantasy championship weekend.
There you go. All right, that is a wrap for the Week 12 waiver wire targets. Thank you to everybody who tuned in. Obviously, good luck attacking those waiver wires. Remember to continue to stay active here, especially in this crucial stretch of the fantasy season heading into the fantasy playoffs. A big shout out to the PFF data collection team, as always, where this data is powered from the best team in the multiverse. And you can check out everything over on pff.com, all the grades and all the written content. With the code Black Friday, you get 40% off a PFF Plus subscription. So, Nate, do please remind everybody what you have up on pff.com this week.
Sure, I have the recaps to all of the games that happened this past weekend. A lot of interesting things. Usually they're very running back focused this week, very wide receiver focused. You saw some of them at the end of the waiver wires that we talked about with the wide receivers, but a lot of interesting things at wide receiver this week. So I have the usage and production report where I have my top 10 takeaways of the week, as well as a tool that has all the stats that I like looking at, and you can filter them and sort them and organize them in a lot of different ways. So I find that very helpful at this point of the season to see trends of what has happened over time. Like last night with Brock Bowers, lots of trends of his playing time, how much he was lining up in the slot, how much he lined up out wide, what the Raiders were doing on offense. So a lot of good things that you can see in the usage and production report. The waiver wire article, just in case there are any changes with injuries today, we'll make any changes accordingly. 5 to add, 5 to drop, 5 to buy low, 5 to sell high. This is the last one of those this season because some leagues already had their trade deadline. A lot of them have them this week. On top of that, our rankings for this upcoming week, rest of season rankings, dynasty rankings will be up tomorrow. Start sit will be on Thursday, and then we'll do it all again next week.
Love it. Yeah, as for me, IDP Fantasy Report, that'll be out or updated very soon here with the Monday night games, and that'll have all the waiver wire targets on the defensive side of the ball, snap shares, usage, my notes, all that kind of stuff as well. IDP rankings will be out on the site. Wide receiver man zone coverage report, red zone report, all that stuff will be out there, and you can get access again to all of that with the PFF Plus subscription, and use the code Black Friday to get 40% off a PFF Plus subscription. I'll see you all on Thursday for the IDP Start Sit show. Good luck in week 12, and until next time, peace out.